My name is Christopher Martin. I'm on the executive committee of the Urban Design Group and also a director of urban strategy at Urban Movement. Amongst other roles, I'm a trustee of Living Streets as well, the UK charity for everyday walking. And together, the Urban Design Group and Living Streets are working very hard at the moment towards building back better. So tonight, we'll be focusing on streets, transport and movement. It's the second time we've focused on this topic, and this is for a very good reason. So much has happened since we last spoke about this, and so much needs to be done in the next few weeks, with a lot of you burning the midnight oil this evening. To help us deliver on time and to do good, we've assembled an expert panel to introduce ideas that are being collected into an open source design guide, but more on that later. First up after me will be Brian Deegan. Brian's infrastructure advisor to the Mayor of Manchester and also principal design engineer at Urban Movement. He's the man to talk to about everything cycling, and he's going to share some insights about how we can design safe and attractive junctions for cycling immediately. After he will be Stephen O'Malley, founding director of Civic Engineers, sharing some thoughts and ideas maybe applicable to Tranche 2 funding, particularly how we can maximise the benefit of this investment and deliver green infrastructure as well. And then just to inspire the conversation is Daniel Jenkins. Daniel's creative director and publisher, but importantly for us today, he's an expert in the retail world, and he's going to share some insights and talk about what retail needs to survive this huge economic crisis and how it can help to shape the communities going forward. So thanks again for tuning in. This is part of a series of Urban Design Group we're undertaking, all about how we design our towns and cities both now, but importantly in the future. Please do check out the events page of the Urban Design Group website for information on future events and how to get involved, and also how to become a member, which is important to not miss out on anything. I think for years now, I've been giving talks, and I've always liked to start to go back to the why we're doing something, connecting a particular topic to bigger agendas and crises, to put this in context and make it plain why we should be doing something. You'll be very sad to hear I'm not going to do that tonight, because for the immediate term, I don't think there's any need. This is why. The government issued a letter to all local authorities last week, as I'm sure you all know, calling for swift and meaningful plans to reallocate road space to cyclists and pedestrians, including on strategic corridors. And if local authorities want to receive any money under this or future tranches, this has to be done. So that's a pretty clear brief and opportunity for us, with the instruction being that we have to meaningfully alter the status quo on the roads to be funded. So this is now the goal of all engineers, planners, architects, and urban designers working in the public realm. And speaking of funding, my understanding of what is on the table is this: £225 million in total, £25 million for London, plus £25 million for bike repair schemes, and an additional £55 million for London already assigned. I suppose more is always more, but with temporary materials and a lot of the ideas we're going to discuss tonight, this can certainly make a huge difference if well spent. From the letter, we know that the priority for towns and cities is filled with permeability, so low traffic neighbourhoods and point closures, which we'll go on to talk about. And after this, with segregated tracks using quick, light and cheap materials. Now, the hit of the whole fruit for me, the deadline for funding bids is tomorrow, and the work has to be completed within 8 weeks for Tranche 1. If this isn't achieved, as far as I understand it, there will not be funding for Tranche 2. And this is the stage where more permanent measures to cement cycling and walking habits will be funded and delivered. So lots to do, and this is, of course, going to bring huge challenges. Local authorities are tooling up at an unprecedented pace. But essentially, we've been reflecting on the fact that they're tooling up without detailed guidance from central government on best practice, which could well be a problem and could cause less than ideal solutions being implemented, and ones that inevitably could be removed, as we've already start to see happen in some places, which is very unfortunate. This is a graph that was shared by Chris Boardman, illustrating what is happening in Manchester at the moment, showing a huge increase in cycling that is happening there and almost certainly happening in all our other towns and cities as well. This is at the heart of this discussion, just like the huge efforts we have gone to protect the NHS, save its capacity for those who need it most. We have to work to protect space in our towns and cities and protect capacity on the streets and public transport for those who need it most. So it's our job to make it inviting to walk and cycle out there, for people to do their duty. Because of this gap in guidance, a group of people have established the Emergency Street Collective, with the aim of producing simple and easy guidance that we can follow to deliver on the government's demands, attract funding, and enable people to enjoyably walk and cycle at the moment and into the future. The group, which I have the pleasure of being involved with, as does Brian and Stephen, has been working flat out to issue the guidance document in the next few days. It was originally going to be tomorrow, but I think in the next few days is likely. So and these are all designed to help and standardize and allow people to work a bit quicker. And we'll hopefully have some members of the team talking later on. The priority for government, as they've stated in their demands, is low traffic neighbourhoods. And so the document has usefully been organised this way. It signposts useful resources which are already out there, and I'd flag these documents to help you establish your own low traffic neighbourhood plans. And I wanted to run through a very quick methodology by way of introduction now as well, so we can create convivial, sociable, relaxing and community streets and spaces. Delivering low traffic neighbourhoods comes down to these three elements, which follows the process that was used in Manchester by Brian to create the B-lines. Urban boulevards are the primary through traffic streets that link a city up. Traffic cells are a network of streets that really vehicles do not need to use unless they're accessing somewhere within it. And connected quiet streets are the streets that act as convenient and attractive links between these cells for people walking and cycling. In terms of a technical process, there are some key steps that we need to go through, which I'll run through quickly, which I've applied to Islington here because I live in Islington and it's as simple as that. First of all, we need to examine the area and identify the main through routes, the main routes for through traffic, as well as notable barriers, the railways, the canals, things like that. And purely by identifying these main through routes, we start to see the emergence of potential cells. Key to these solutions, though, is identification of what we need to do in order to reinforce these cells. And this point about reinforcing the nature of these potential cells is crucial. We can't simply pick quieter streets and neighbourhoods, which at the moment we have to create them. And there are plenty of examples of this kind of filtering in London. These types of measures that the government are calling for in the next 8 weeks, lumps of concrete have even been referred to in some of the DFT letters. So you can sense the immediacy required, but the soon to be published guidance will certainly suggest how we can also create these with more attractive features. And something that Stephen might pick up on later as well as part of the tranche 2 funding. We might want to consider how we can incorporate green infrastructure as well in these things. So with a simple filter, we've come a long way. But now we need to think about how we connect these quiet traffic cells. What are the attractive connecting streets that enable people of all ages to walk and cycle between these cells? This is how the B-lines in Manchester were created. And this is where co-creating with the community has always been invaluable. And at the moment, using websites to engage the community should be looked at as well to help with this step. And we know what these kind of streets look like. And we can further reinforce their calmness and conviviality with quick, light and cheap measures such as these, focusing on either traffic management techniques, street design techniques, and traffic calming techniques, with the first two sections especially being key for immediate deployment. And mapping is quite an attractive walking and cycling streets. We need to focus on where they interact with the main through traffic routes and make sure that we deliver attractive and safe crossings at this point. At the moment, we need to get these in quickly and cheaply. And Brian is going to get down and dirty with what you can actually do at junctions in a second, whilst I stay in the lofty heights of calm and convivial streets. But it's not over yet. As a final step, which of these main arterial routes, often with key high streets along them, do we need to upgrade into urban boulevards with safe space for walking and cycling? And this is where we get to the issue of light segregation, using quick, light and cheap measures to create attractive routes segregated from traffic that the DFT letter is calling for. Importantly, though, and now more so than ever potentially, these measures together reinforce and strengthen the communities and community centres, and are at the heart of an increasing push for 15-minute cities. I know Daniel will talk about this notion from a retail side of things later, but from the urban side of things, low traffic neighbourhood measures need to reinforce the strengthening of communities, of the local, and the growing sense of community we have seen recently. Thinking about what people can walk and cycle to is crucial in all this. And mashing a few agendas together, I've created a toolkit around the idea of the Popsicle City, communities where children can walk or cycle by themselves safely to the local high street and shops, buy a popsicle, and get home before it melts. But more on that another time. All these details will be bundled in the COVID Safe Streets design guide that the Emerging Street Collective will be launching in the next few days, as I've said. But now I want to pass over to Mr. Brian Deegan to introduce some innovative ideas for safe junction designs that can be delivered immediately. Brian, please take over.
Thanks for that, Chris. I'll just try not to press all the wrong buttons. Practice this before. Looks like we're in. Yeah, so the last time I was invited to speak here, I kind of just hurried through lots of different link options you could do in a temporary manner to go through that. And also talked a little bit about side roads. What I really want to talk about today is what happens with junctions, and in particular, like signal control junctions of varying different sizes. It's great that people have started putting out the pop-up lanes, but we're all getting a little bit worried if they just run straight up to the stop line of our major junctions, where in some cities that's where 80% of the collisions take place. So we want people to be encouraged to cycle, but we want to keep them safe while we're doing it. The other factor is that I've tried to set myself as a logic puzzle is that altering a signal control junction in the UK can cost you up to £1 million. In fact, in some cases, there's that Bedford one that's close to £1 billion, albeit there's quite a few links on the road. So it's an expensive business, and it's time consuming, and it's technical in a lot of modeling. So like you have to get a computer chip to fit in with the signal control options to get it to even work, and there could be as much as a 3-month turnaround in getting those. So the idea I set myself is, what can we do without actually physically altering any of the kit or the timing and junctions? What can we do with like cones and line marking and paint and like psychological techniques? Some of the stuff that we are seeing applied on some streets now, but can we use some of those techniques to make our junctions safer during the crisis? That's really what I'm going to cover next few minutes when it stops working. There we go. So I'll just run through a few options, and I'll really hone in on a couple of, frankly, fairly outlandish, but perhaps we need something like this in the crisis. One of the things we did in Greater Manchester early on, the signal control team did, was just to reduce the delay for pedestrians and extend the time to cross, that kind of magic combination, so people aren't waiting 2 minutes to get across the road and clustering in bunches, potentially infecting each other. It's a flick of a switch at a traffic control unit, and everybody really should be considering these kind of options, even if you do nothing else. But I'm hoping I'm going to talk you into a few more things. And I know we're all putting our bids in, and it's basically link-based, but we are still going to have to come up with some ways of doing junctions. Another thing you can do is like double cycle the junction. So rather than waiting that 2 minutes, you're waiting 1 minute. So you can run through all the cycles in a kind of double speed. It's not as efficient, but still, again, it reduces that delay and gets people more likely to comply with the junctions as well. When it comes to massive roundabouts, I'm rattling through these, but I want to get to the real juicy ones. I've shown this diagram here just to illustrate, and I'll try and get my mouse going to kind of show you. The dotted lines are a standard UK geometrical layout for a roundabout. And they have these enormous sweeping turns. We call them easy exits, and they are quite easy if you're in a car, but they're particularly difficult if you're cycling, you're trying to get through the roundabout, and people can swing across, people driving cars, that is, at like very high speeds. Very efficient for getting cars through, but a little bit of a nightmare if you're trying to walk across, and a little bit of a nightmare if you're cycling. I've shown this diagram to show a more continental layout that's been put on top in the solid black line there. Now, frankly, this could be coned into existence without too much effort. So we can just look at the geometry of things, and that will have a very big difference on the way that cars are behaving. And the name of the game of walking and cycling has always been to mitigate for the more damaging effects of cars. So there's a lot we can do just in geometrical terms, particularly at some of our larger junctions, that I think will have a real say. If you look at that now that it's nice and tight and cars have to swing in and out to go around, that's really going to be traffic calming. Means for people crossing, walking, they've got an easier crossing one. They're not trying to cross this. And our cyclists might be able to take a more primary through there. Or really when you could potentially cone out a Dutch-style roundabout like we did ourselves in the middle of the field when I was working for Transport for London. These geometrical layouts do work. They're not spectacularly efficient for cars, which is why we haven't really rolled them out. But in an emergency, we're trying to get people through junctions safer. Introducing parallel crossings, getting a more continental geometry can really help people out. So notice the curve there for the engineers there, that it's a re-entrant one. Okay, carry on, Brian. Adding some more signal crossings at junctions can also have like a real effect. A standard T junction that's signalised in the UK, you might have one, maybe two green men. What about the other arm? If you introduce it now, again, people don't all have to focus on one point of the junction, collect there in groups to get across. If you can start putting some other crossings in, that can really help. In this case, if you can make dedicated parallel signal crossings for cyclists as well, so you can putting a new crossing, allow cyclists to make the movement there, and you've got a completely safe way of getting through quite major junctions. Something that we've been already looking at doing in Greater Manchester, and I'm hoping more people consider these things. Right, into the big stuff. Have a quick swig. I saw this drawing, someone sent it to me from America, of a kind of temporary junction, and I've really been playing around over the last few weeks of can we do a British style equivalent that's quite funky, and it's quite colourful, and it's temporary, and I quite like it. I like the way that the paint's like effectively like crunched the whole junction down, so it's a much more compact junction than the one it was before. Rather than 3 lanes approaching, it's taken it down to single lanes, and it's put some like flexible posts in there so cars can still turn, but there's quite a lot of space for pedestrians and cyclists to still get across. So I've been playing around, could we do this kind of option in the UK? And I want to share some ideas of how we potentially might do it. And one of the ways we could do, and I'll probably have some better visuals by tomorrow, but I thought I'd show some plan view. So I apologise if it's hard interpreting these for certain people. This is a signal junction that I basically like put a bag over all the signal headers and just made it like appear like the American one, putting in zebras with parallel crossings so cyclists can go through, go with priority. Pedestrians can always cross whenever they want, and kind of mimicking that protected approach. They're probably like with all signal junctions, it's very hard to come up with like here's a standard detail because they're all very different. Like a junction, for example, that had like 500 right turners an hour would have a completely different geometrical layout to one that had 5. It's definitely, you need to know the cars going through, but still this concept of like going to a kind of give way situation for cars and like prioritizing people walking and cycling through it could be something that we look at. But perhaps we can go even further. This is an example, just to finish off my thought experiment, and these are concepts at the moment, but really in order to meet the crisis, I'm hoping some of them can go quickly towards build. Here's one that actually maintains the full signal operation of the junction, so we don't get kickbacks from people who say, actually, I need that green man. I want to know that I've got a conflict-free crossing from the pedestrian side, and also where we've got like opposing turns for cars that would be difficult to track in the space. Anyway, you can still keep an existing signal layout in this kind of approach. And I basically put a colourful crossing in and done these kind of protective islands to kind of mimic it. I'll zoom in slightly so I can show you what a cyclist would do and what the method of control would be. So if our cyclist is coming through on this side, and I hope you can see my mouse going through there. Let's take this in detail. So they come through. Oh, I've lost it now. There we go. Come through. It's a red light. They wait at the stop line like all of the cars. Then there's a green. Now they can come through at this stage. They can, I've lost my mouse, but bear with me. They can move out into the general traffic lane, probably easier to see on that one, to move in with cars and go through. Well, there's also enough space to just go through in the lane. It's a cyclist, whatever they want to do. Or they can pull into this kind of green strip area and have that protected island to kind of wait behind to basically avoid the left hook and to wait until they feel safe to cross. So it's like for new people coming back to cycling, the ones we're trying to encourage might get very intimidated at a multi-lane approach, in which case they might want to go through to the left there. That's usually the worst position to be in at a signal junction. But if we put some kind of protective island in there, then you can effectively go over there and wait until they feel safe to cross, wait to see that a car's actually stopped to give way for them. And with this kind of arrangement, they might well do that. So when they're going through, they can go through the green. If there's cars swinging across their path there, then they can kind of wait until they feel safe to go. I'm hoping this kind of like a colourful crossing arrangement will suggest to vehicles, particularly if you've got like a COVID emergency sign on the approach, to look out for cyclists. And if they don't wait and the cars are just going through, you can wait there until you feel safe, and then that arm will stop. Maybe that's the time to go. Maybe you want to go with the pedestrians, but I'm trying to be forgiving for whatever cyclists do, and particularly the ones that feel they want to go to the near side and feel protected. This is a way of just dropping some island in there. It could in fact be flexible posts, just some kind of safe space to wait on the near side if they don't want to position themselves more defensively to cross the junction. This is I've not used any prescribed road markings to do this. The only one that goes in there is the use of the thick blocks there, the elephant footprints, which basically mean there's a cycle route going that way, which there is. The use of the colourful crossing is quite well established, albeit there's a little bit of concern sometimes about ones that mimic zebras. But again, we're in emergencies. This is a kind of common situation. I'll show you an example from Holland where we look to, and I really want to draw your attention to the kind of elliptical island that's on the right of the image there. So if you're a cyclist and you're waiting, let's pretend they go the same way as us. You're waiting there. There's some kind of island that deflects traffic that's turning away from your path, and you can wait. In the Dutch case, you go across parallel with the pedestrians. They've got the kind of signalised zebra arrangement. But in our case, we can just go when we feel safe or when there's enough of a gap or there isn't traffic turning across it. So it's effectively giving people some kind of protected space to wait into a junction so they can go when they feel safe enough to do so. That's the fundamental of a protected junction. And we've found signalised junctions in Manchester. We've been pushing the Cyclops approach, and it's fantastic and it's efficient for everybody. And I'd love to roll those out, but they are quite expensive and they do take time. And it's you've got to redo all your signals posts. I'm trying to see if we can get there and give full priority for pedestrians and cyclists in most instances just by painting and dropping some infrastructure around. So that's the kind of big one to share, and I'm hoping people will get back to me. I'll just show a few others. In some cases, some failed experiments, but there might well be other people cleverer than me that can figure out how to do it. I was looking at the cycle gates, which effectively meet a cyclist towards that front stop line, so a very efficient way. I'm thinking, could we do that in a temporary way? I showed this kind of standard detail of dropping a stop line back and putting an extra signal pole so we can warn cyclists not to go down the near side of vehicles, but we can also hold cars back so cyclists can get an advantage when the lights turn green. Speaking to my technical colleagues who are a little bit worried about the intergreens, if we set that stop line back when it goes red for cars, it could still be crossing a junction by the time another car comes out parallel. So it's a little bit trickier, but potentially could be worked up, particularly if you've got some slack in your intergreen because of the geometrical layout. Far too much information, I know that for most people, but to show other options that are available. Again, bagging the signals, going for a four-way stop like American style with it's a lot easier to get stop lines in now. And frankly, that's the behavior we want. If we go to the situation where drivers are approaching green lights and they think, let's go, I've got a conflict-free turn, that's a real problem. We've got lots of inexperienced cyclists out in the street there. And it's a problem in general. That's why we have so many collisions. So anything we got that says to a driver, hey, think about it, give way. Here's like a variation we could do of giving priority to one of the minor arms, perhaps one with a key workers route on and having stop lines on the others. Again, not going to be particularly efficient if it used to be a signal junction, but needs to be considered as far as I'm concerned. Something that the Department for Transport have been trying to edge out, but for me, I'll say something radical, and this is not something that you can particularly do overnight, but I want to put it out there. We really shouldn't have any green lights at all for cars at the moment. I'm suggesting that it should go from red to flashing amber and stay there. And most drivers, particularly people of my age or older, will know exactly what that means. It means proceed with care, look out for people. And that's what we need people to do at all signal junctions, particularly where we've got inexperienced cyclists. So bring back the flashing amber to signal junctions. That's one thing we could do. And again, it's quite a simple fix. More switch off the signals options. I'm a real big fan of signal control junctions. Don't get me wrong, but I acknowledge how long they take. And so in some cases, in these emergency cases, if we're tying off space on the approach, turning off the signals can be a real go-to. This is one in Bexley Heath. I could have showed the pointer one where they took out signal junctions and just did implied roundabouts. It's not a roundabout, it's a crossroad junction, but drivers treat it like that. In this case, they've got implied zebras on the approach, so cars are looking out for pedestrians. It's all quite nice, and they had a big reduction in collisions as a result of doing this compared to the signal control junction. And particularly in this case, and in Poynton's case, they actually got more cars through as well. So people are slowing down, they're thinking, they're looking out for each other and going through this. This could well be our approach. And I know the current Minister of Transport was a fan of signal removal in the end, so well, back in the day, so give a few options for him. Here's a kind of like a design detail of how you could do it. Again, bag the signals, get some kind of pattern that kind of suggests some roundabout motion, put your zebras in there, just try and promote safe, courteous behaviour. And if the cars are looking out for each other and turning around, I'm hoping they'll be looking out for pedestrians and cyclists in the mix as well. I'll just show a couple more things because I know I've probably gone way over my time, but Chris hasn't started waving at me yet, so I'll keep going. Just to show this from like what we did in the early superhighways. This is like pictures courtesy of TfL here when I work for them. So you see a left slip road there. There's a kind of standard UK junction on the left. And what the team did at TfL was to tighten it up, taking out the left slips and paint these lanes across. Now, there was a few issues because cyclists were releasing the same stage as cars. So you still had left-turning cars and right-turning cars cutting across the path of head cyclists who were on the near side and perhaps overly promoted to be in that position. But that kind of junction arrangement with a band turn, a band left turn, suddenly becomes a very high level of service for cyclists. Perhaps that left turn can be done somewhere else on the network. Perhaps the cycle route can be merged off the main strip and just go through this junction. So band turns have always been the best friend of cycling and walking provision. If we can get those in there, we can get a real high level of service just by blocking out certain movements. And particularly if we're coning straight up to junctions, for me, this has to become a legitimate option. A couple more things you can do. They're slightly weaker, but we still have it in the arsenal. So I've got to be a completist and say, like, just warning signs for drivers to look out for drivers to look out for cyclists. Positive messaging out there, like, look, that's not just one of those cyclists you hate. This is a key worker. That could be an NHS person off to save someone's life. Give them a bit of space. All these kind of messages will still work as part of the mix as well, I would say. And I'll finish on the kind of like, I've given a few ideas that may seem radical for some. For me, they're exactly what we need in the current emergency. We'll finish on the absolute minimum we could do is to do the kind of Danish style approach. The Danes reintegrate cyclists back into traffic on the approach to signal junctions. And the concept we call it in the UK is the mixing zone. And the concept of a mixing zone is that cyclists go through a priority and cars arrive, and they do their cross movement before they get to the stop line. So the cars that are going left could have crossed to the left. The cyclists that are going ahead could have crossed to go ahead, albeit they do it with priority in this case, you can see by the giveaway. And by doing that, when the lights actually turn, what we don't get is cyclists crawling up the near side and then getting hit by left turners. They've already been positioned in the most defensive point. And for me, that's the very least we can do, particularly for an experienced cyclist who might feel they have to stay near the curbside. They might have done cycle proficiency back in the day, which is responsible for a lot of curb hugging. But if you do go through to signal junctions and you've got a heavy left turn of large vehicles coming across you, that's not going to feel great and might well put people off. And we need as many people in the nation to cycle as possible at the moment. It's our duty to keep them safe. So I'm hoping there's some options there you can think about. When the bids come back and you're told to do these things and you've got great plans, don't forget the junctions. They're just as important. I kind of have a rule when I'm designing, never pin a cyclist to the left unless you're going to protect them at the junction. I'm hoping people take that principle on board. That's enough for me for now, I think.
Thanks very much, Brian. Insightful as always, and I'm sure we'll pick up a lot of that in the conversation afterwards. Stephen, can I call on you to reflect on this and give some insight into incorporating blue and green infrastructure? You're muted, Stephen.
Schoolboy error. Thank you very much. Thanks very much for the invitation to speak this evening. I do have a few slides here, which I'll just quickly share with you. Some very interesting ideas there from Brian. I think there's two different stages to this conversation. Perhaps one is the emergency response to the funding that's available to deal with the provision of cycling infrastructure. And that's critical that we create or save that space. And the whole series of temporary measures, whether that's coning or concrete blocks or whatever it may be, is absolutely crucial to wrestle that space back from what is currently highway traffic space. It's also a way of dealing with the need for getting people into cities when public transport isn't recommended for use, or there's clearly complications and sensitivities around public transport. But what we don't want to do is encourage people to start to buy cars and reuse cars and getting cars back into cities, which is wholly counterproductive and may actually undo quite a lot of successful work that's been achieved over the last number of years. But looking beyond that and looking at the next wave of funding that comes through, where we start to hardwire in some of these changes in habits and patterns into our streets and cityscapes, these are some principles that could be adopted going forward. This streetscape arrangement here is based on the Dutch Frietstraat arrangement. This is for relatively low levels of traffic. I think what's quite interesting with these spaces is how it's transitionary. Time is an important factor in how patterns change in our streets and spaces. And we employ just the cultural dimension, which means that we want to try and encourage people to deal with the seasonal cycling here, the hardy Danes, obviously cycling in all sorts of weather conditions. But any Northern European or many Northern European cities are confronted with the same climatic challenges that we here in the UK are confronted with. And it's about enabling those patterns to develop over time. But in terms of applying those principles, this is Altrincham in South Manchester. This photograph probably dates from about 2013. Altrincham at that time had been identified as one of the worst performing high streets in the country with the Portis report post-recession. And there was a whole myriad of factors that came into play, and not just investment, but also energy from different sources, not least of which was Altrincham Market. But we had a role to play in that too with the streetscapes. This is the post-implementation image of the same space, picking up on some of those Frietstraat principles. Narrow carriageways, the central rib that runs, textured rib, contrasting colour and texture, that offers the segregation and also narrows and tightens up the perceived available space for vehicles and motorists as they travel through here, dampening speeds. Brian has talked about the regulations and traffic lights, quite rightly, in terms of some of the existing systems that we have, many of the existing systems that we have. But perhaps what's more interesting or ultimately more rewarding as a pedestrian as you go through these spaces is where they're more intuitive, self-regulating environments. So by virtue of the geometry, the landscape, the forward visibility, the lane width, combination of all these factors, the activity along the sides of the street, the friction, speeds and driver behavior is moderated. And there's some of these principles embedded here. I would also pick up on the point that Brian made about inferred roundabouts, and you used Bexley Heath as an example. We were also involved in the Poynton scheme. These projects, as everybody on this call I'm sure knows, are very complex. And what we've got to deal with very, very sensibly and responsibly is how people with sensory impairment or visual impairment, physical impairment, navigate their way through these streets and spaces and ensuring that those routes are safe and straightforward for those people to make those choices. This space here is much more of a provocation than an actual delivery. This is Great Ancoats Street in Manchester, and it's an urban motorway that cuts off the right-hand flank of the city from the city centre. There's some significant development that's taken place out on this eastern edge, not least of which is Ancoats and New Islington. But the routes from the city centre, which is in the right-hand side of this photo, across into these neighbourhoods is severed by this existing urban motorway. And there's a very serious question there, which the emergency response and the emergency funding offers up the opportunity to fundamentally change how these spaces are used. And with a new paradigm, it's possible that these streets and spaces could be reconfigured in a way that allows us to structure the space using green infrastructure. So there could be a network of rain gardens, trees, other features that, again, narrow available lane space and provide segregated, comfortable cycling. We like to use the metric of an unaccompanied 12-year-old to be able to access and cycle through these spaces with confidence. This is a piece of work that working with Brian and Chris on actually in Glasgow. This is Argyle Street. For those that know Glasgow, this is Central Station in the background of this image. So you can see how close it is right to the central gravity of the city centre itself and just how much tarmac there is. This is part of the Avenues programme, 115 million, looking at a network of 16 streets across the city centre. It is critical to consider these things at a network scale, obviously, because what we're interested in is door-to-door experience and making sure that the comfort of that journey is straightforward and legible from the point of entering the system from your doorway at your home through to wherever your destination is during the course of your average day. But this is a revised component. This piece of work actually is now at REBA stage 4. It was due to commence this year, but Glasgow City Council suspended the start date as a result of their being awarded the COP26 climate conference that was due to take place in the autumn, which is now knocked back a year as a result of the COVID crisis. However, this work is very much intended to be delivered. You can see there's a fundamental reordering of the space, some of the principles of the Titan geometry, the use of the rib again in the Fiat Stat model, but flanked on each side of the carriageway are reed beds. There's a very shallow railway tunnel here, which means that our ability to plant trees is constrained by that tunnel. However, we have argued successfully to include 4 fairly substantial rain gardens that are part of a wider network that discharges surface water back into the Clyde. And then there is segregated cycling on the outside between the buildings, the pavement and the rain gardens. There's a segregated cycle lane in each direction. The static boundary where the rain gardens are can also be used for, in certain instances, for loading or for bus stopping. A London-based scheme. These images here, illustrations, are showing some of the SUDS features. These are rain gardens that have been used again in White Hart Lane, in this instance, in Haringey, in the shadow of Tottenham's new ground, for those football fans on the call. This network of rain gardens has been scattered across the landscape to structure and order the space. This is a before image showing these poor people in this fairly hostile, fairly negative environment in the shadow of this poor tree, which has been edged out with tarmac. And I think it's interesting just to point out how much space has been redeemed as a result of the adjustment to the geometry within the street. You can probably make out, if you can see my cursor, you can see this is the same tree, but the curb line has been pulled right out, minimizing the amount of space available for vehicles. It's still a bus route. Lengthy negotiations with TfL as to what the acceptable minimum dimension was for 2A bus route on a relatively busy street with retail on it as well and some other businesses. But these, you can see the apertures in the face of the curbs here. The highway drainage sheds across the surface and drains in through these apertures into these rain gardens that are scattered across the plan. This is an image showing, this is an image showing one of the double-decker buses travelling down along the street with the rain gardens ordering and holding and framing the street, and also the use of some imprinted asphalt. So the principle here really is actually, the materials here are pretty thrifty. It's about the composition and arrangement of the street and the features that are embedded within it, not necessarily the pursuit of attractive, high quality materials in and of themselves, although clearly that can improve and does improve the overall environmental quality of the street and the experience. I think that's my last slide, actually, Chris.
Perfect timing. Thanks, Stephen. Really good. Daniel's up next, and I'm really pleased he's been able to join us tonight to give us a completely different perspective on all this and let us know, in a way, as designers, what we might want to consider in terms of retail and retail environments going forward. So I'd like to invite Daniel to give us some insight for a few minutes.
Thank you, Chris. I found that particularly interesting, both as a consumer but as a road user. I'm now based out in the countryside, but I work in London. And the COVID crisis has been interesting to see the number of people who are now cycling locally, whether they're going from the village I live in into our local town or around our local towns and stuff. And it's been pleasing to see, but we also are at present an area with particularly bad, as Chris knows, so the traffic signals. We're a bit of an accident black spot locally, which is something which puts a lot of people off cycling. Anyway, so that was all very interesting, and I must say that the flashing amber thing is a particular, I like that a lot. So I come at this from a slightly different perspective. I'm almost the sort of the heart versus the head, but with an understanding that, off the back of the coronavirus situation, we have an opportunity long-term to create a more interesting and perhaps stronger local economy. We've seen over the last sort of 10, 15 years a move away from the high street towards malls and department stores. and a move back towards sort of homogenous sort of city centres. You could be in Bristol, Cardiff, Glasgow, Manchester. 20, 30 years ago, they were all different. Now they all have pockets which look quite similar. But there are places that are doing something a little bit different. Near to me, we have the small town of Frome, which prides itself on being fairly independent. They have one particular area called Catherine Hill, in which every business is an independent business. And what that tends to do is it creates a sense of community. And that's the one thing I think that we need to try and, you guys need to do as designers, and we as shopkeepers, shop owners, whatever, need to do together. It's an idea that you work together as a group of people to create something which then strengthens all of your businesses. So, for example, you have the idea that you'd have the local butchers, the local bakers, and weirdly enough, we have a candlestick maker as well, where people can go and spend time, whether they've traveled there on bicycle or they've parked or they've walked, and they can spend a day there sort of doing their shopping, meeting friends, partaking in the local economy. The other thing that we've noticed is that during this crisis, that it tends to be the small independents of the businesses that step up. They're the people who, maybe it's because their livelihood really is on the line, they turn around and start to seek new and agile ways to do new things. So an example of that is in Bath, Landrace Bakery, which opened about 18 months ago. It's in a beautiful location. Bath is one of the prettiest cities in the world, but it also is a fairly bland and boring shopping experience. It's a bland and boring restaurant experience. It's a bland and boring drinking experience. It's a fairly boring place to be beyond the beautiful architecture. What Landrace and some of their contemporaries, such as the Beckford Bottle Shop and a couple of new restaurants have done, is they've sort of popped in and said, right, we're going to try and do something different. We'll leave Costa Coffee and Starbucks for the high street, and we're going to create areas where people can spend time. They can sit outside, they can have a coffee, they can meet friends, they can do some bigger shopping, they can do some little bits and bobs. Those are the sort of things which in future we're going to have to see more of. I don't know about you, or anyone on this call, but I'm not massively keen about the idea of queuing outside a supermarket. But at the same time, I'm not, unless you're waking up at 2 o'clock in the morning, getting a slot for Waitrose or for whoever. So what I'm finding is that, my clients, whether they're in the fashion industry or elsewhere, are thinking, well, how can we work together? How can we form relationships with people that were traditionally our competitors, but actually in the long run will be our friends? So what we've been, one of the things that we're sort of talking about is understanding that you need to know your customer. Sometimes you need to offer your customer something which they don't quite know they want yet. But, you need to build a relationship, and the idea that, person A is no longer just a number. Person A is Andrea, and Andrea likes to buy, sourdough bread twice a week. Or, you could be a clothes shop and you understand that what you're buying for your customers season on season, year after year. It's only through these sort of things, plus with help from local authorities and communities, where we say, we're going to get together, we're going to do things. For example, again, in Frome, they have a monthly market, in which they close all the town off to traffic. They put out stalls, and everyone turns up. It's a huge, huge success. It's a way of people being able to, like Columbia Road, pop into the local businesses, to see the people who are there permanently, but also to sort of congregate and see the people who are there temporarily. It gives you that experience, and that is what we're going to need, because we need to build customer confidence as well as business confidence. We need to make people feel like they can invest in our future economy, because we are a nation of shopkeepers. It's just that in the past we were a nation of shopkeepers where the shopkeeper lived above the shop, and we've become more a nation of shopkeepers where the shopkeeper is actually a large multinational corporation. Now, there's a place for that because they offer something that a lot of people need. We all engage with those businesses, but the smartest ones are the ones that understand that you also need the small independent businesses. You need the people who are invested in the area, the person who comes from the local community or has moved there and is wishing and hoping to open up their dream business. They're investing their time, their effort, and their money into creating something which hopefully will enable people to be excited about going. And it's only then that perhaps you could argue the environment that's built outside becomes important, because if you don't have the excitement and the community and the stuff for people to invest in or to spend their time visiting, then the other stuff sort of becomes a little bit irrelevant. I mean, it is a catch-22. You know, you want to be in that situation where it's nice to walk from your house. Chris talks about the popsicle theory, and we had the idea of the urban boulevard. The village I live in at the minute is popular primarily because, you know, it's a very pretty village, but it has a fairly well-stocked local shop. It has a post office. But what happens is that people are travelling from other villages in their cars to come here to go and do their mail or to do their shopping, to do their banking. We need to find a way of perhaps bringing that sort of community-based idea that we have in parts of London with the idea of the corner shop, and bringing it back into sort of more rural areas and to sort of suburban areas where people understand that they're able to walk to things. I've got a 3-year-old nephew, and there's an issue that, you know, he and his parents, they live in Surbiton, and for them to go and do any form of shopping, they jump in the car because they don't want to go on the bike because they see it as slightly scary or nervous or whatever. But what they found is that in the area that they live, people have started to open up little businesses, and those are the businesses that they frequent because the transport links are good and they offer them something which is a little bit different. So to bring it back, you know, it's perhaps it's not relevant to a lot of you guys, but it does affect all of us. It's this idea of confidence, of getting people to buy into community, of making businesses understand that they need to work together with you guys in the design industry, but also with each other to build spaces which people want to spend their time and their money in. You know, I spoke about the idea of department stores. There's a lot of theory in the design of department store interiors where people talk about this idea that you go in to buy a toaster and you leave with, you know, a pair of rubber gloves, a toaster, something for your aunt's birthday, and a pile of other things, because they make things complicated for people to travel around and see stuff. One of the better ways of doing it, I think, and the more modern way of doing it, is to create something in which people want to spend their time there. So it's a nice experience to go, it's a nice experience to be there, and it's a nice experience to go home. There are few things worse than having spent a nice, relaxing day, seeing some friends, maybe doing a bit of shopping, and your walk home is a nightmare, or your cycle home is terrible. But there has to be the thing that gets people excited, particularly as we look at, you know, the younger generation, who are a generation where everything's at their fingertips. You know, you can sign into Ocado now and get your food delivered. You can go into Net-a-Porter, ASOS, Boohoo.com, whatever, and have things delivered within, you know, there's even that place called Amazon that will deliver stuff for you within 24 hours easily. So in order to attract people to communities and shopping centres and to places where they will spend money, which then means that the businesses are able to thrive and spend more money on business rates and on rent and everything else, we have to provide them with the better environment, but also with that quirky little coffee shop, that little place that makes chocolate that's a little bit different. I know it seems superfluous and a little bit silly, but those are the little things and moments which perhaps elevate the everyday. Because I think for a lot of people, life is not so much about the special moments, but it's in part about, you know, how do we improve day-to-day life? How do we improve, you know, what you do in your lunch hour when you come out of work? You know, how do we improve what you do afterwards? How do we get people to go and meet friends again after work, or, you know, to go and do things which are fun and friendly and invest? And it's about that sort of, that community building, that confidence, and that idea that, you know, we can do something a bit different, which is why, weirdly, I do believe that although this is an awful, awful time for all of us, there is an opportunity for us to perhaps to sit and pause and think and look at what the future is. I don't know whether you guys are aware that there's been a lot of talk in the fashion industry in particular about the idea of getting rid of sales. removing discount, which at first glance seems like a bad idea for a lot of people. But post 2008, an awful lot of retail businesses moved to a very quick sort of slash and burn policy when it came to retail discounts. So clothing that was delivered in January was pretty much ready to be worn in July. And then clothing delivered in July was ready to be worn in December, which meant that people were buying out of season and that they were buying into things that perhaps they didn't need, which then meant that we ended up with discounts. The problem with discounts is they're great for the consumer until you start to look at what the margin on each item is. And there's a movement at the minute towards an idea that perhaps that we get rid of sales, we stop these large discounts, we provide people with the goods, the seasonal things they need at the right time. It's like with food, it's like with everything else. But it gives us a chance to perhaps invest and engage in things that are going to be pleasant for us now, rather than simply buying things that, it's because they're 50% off and we don't need them, which means we consume less, but we consume better. And if we consume better, we have better experiences. And if we have better experiences, we want to do more things and we want to, invest in what's around us. I mean, again, it's this idea that during this crisis, like I said before, it's the smaller businesses, it's the pubs doing takeaways, it's the places offering, selling fruit and veg who are now offering sort of the ability to deliver stuff, or you to be taken around on a bicycle, or to do things which are a little bit more interesting and different. And they protect all of us because, unfortunately, June 15th comes next week and they're going to be looking to open up a lot more stores. But as we saw in Paris recently, shops were busy the first 2 or 3 days, but the average basket spend was much higher than it was previously because people weren't going in and doing that thing where you patronize a store 6 or 7 times a season and buy a different thing, or spend even time in there seeing, your people who work in shops, which is a large part of the retail experience. But people were going in and buying bulk items at once. That's great if you're spending £600 when normally they'd be spending £200. The problem is if they were going 4 times a season and spending £800 and they're now spending £600 in one hit, we all end up with less money, which then means that the shops are quiet the rest of the time. And retail, which is an industry, particularly those working on the shop floor, tends to be quite fickle. And it tends to be something where people, are at greater risk of losing their jobs. So again, it's that idea that we need to build these communities and we need to offer people alternative ways. I mean, I've been looking at the stuff you guys have been putting up, and as a retailer, as someone in the industry, it's all music to my ears, because the nicer the street, the more likely the people are going to want to be there, to go and shop there. The idea that, the Tottenham one is a perfect example. I'm a big football fan. I've been up to the new Tottenham Stadium, and that part of the world wasn't great before. But now you create somewhere that people want to spend their time and their money. And, Tottenham is a good example in the fact that they open the stadium 3 or 4 hours before the game. You're able to go and have a beer or some food or do some shopping, or it becomes a whole retail experience. Again, it's about customer confidence, but it's in part because the built environment is attractive and you don't feel like you're in a sort of, a nasty neighborhood, or you don't feel like you're uncomfortable. You feel happy, surrounded by the trees and whatever. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great tee up to the conversation, some of the questions we've been having. And I think the idea of building community and that sort of attraction is something that we've had a few questions about, and Paul Reynolds has raised a really interesting one linked to all this, and it's about how we deal with parking. And lots of people have been talking about parklets as well.